G'day, Aisha Mahar here. This video is about borderline fantasy and how it subsumes people with codependency. And what might I mean by that? Well, if somebody is being subsumed, let's start with that. It means that you're being included in a way, but absorbed in something or someone else. So you're being subsumed by the person with BPD. All your attention and focus is going there. And the other aspect of that is the borderline, oh sorry, making mistakes here with buttons. The borderline fantasy. And what is the borderline fantasy all about? Well, my goodness, that's enough of that, right? So people with BPD have fantasies, but more to the point, where there is no self in people with BPD, they have a fantasy self. They have a false self, but they can have this interplay with a fantasy self. And let's first of all think about what fantasy means, and then get into what is the fantasy self or the fantasy aspect within those with BPD. Always going to be a phone. Sorry about that. So, the fantasy, what is fantasy, first of all, in this sense, and how am I using the word in relation to borderline personality? I'm just going to try to make sure that phone isn't going to go off again. So, fantasy is the activity of imagining things, especially things that are impossible or improbable. Like a person with borderline personality untreated can't love you, doesn't see you, isn't in the here and now with you. The relationships are impossible. The borderline fantasy of relationship, of love, of attaching, and the codependent not understanding yet, but being somewhat in collusion with the borderline fantasy that's subsuming the codependent. It is the borderline imagining things, relationships and love and attachment that are impossible, and not only improbable, impossible if untreated. And so a fantasy image, typically on which a person with BPD would dwell at length or repeatedly, and it reflects an unconscious, a lot of unconscious wishes. It reflects nothing from consciousness. It is the notion of being independent, for example, of a person with borderline personality, but it is a child's ultimate fantasy of attachment, of love, need as love, and so much more. So, how do people need is confused as love, and seeking identity is confused with quote attachment unquote? So what am I really talking about here? People with BPD having this fantasy, or fantasies, multiple. Well, in people with BPD, they definitely have an overriding, underpinning fantasy of who they really aren't. It happens, why? Because it becomes this protective aspect or reality for them of trying to escape from the lack of self, from having no sense of self, from not knowing themselves, from the no self, the arrested emotional developed self that stops growing emotionally, psychologically by the age of 2 with that arrested emotional development. So the fantasy is one that takes the place of the lack of self. And yeah, it's through the false self, But the fantasy is very childlike. And the fantasy of many with untreated BPD is the fantasy of something attached to, you know what I'm going to say next, right? The repetition compulsion cycles. Because it's not only attached to a desire that isn't in our consciousness for reparation, it's attached more to escapism and more to the point, the protection of the lack of self. But the borderline fantasy is really even more so about magical thinking and what they feel, right? What they feel is all that could be real, and that's not thinking, that's distorted perception. But this fantasy is protective, yes, but what okay, let's get to it. The fantasy really is at the heart of all fantasies. Magical thinking, cognitively distorted thinking of people with untreated, especially borderline personality. The fantasy is one of rescue. And it's not in the conscious mind. It's usually an unconscious fantasy. But people with BPD that I've worked with over the years too have described this to me. Like they have a fantasy of something just going better or different with other people or whatever they're aware of. And so they might just create, be aware of it or not, a lie. It causes drama and chaos. It gets them a lot of attention. But that attention is sought by many people with BPD, not for the supply like the narcissist, but to feel a little bit, to feel real, to feel emotionally safe, to have your focus on them more solidifies in this fantasy way. They're seeking identity through you. So when you disagree with them and when you don't mirror back what they need and want from you, which is like they don't know the difference between self and other. So, in that regard, they're basically in this fantasy of you need to mirror to them who they are. So that's why, like, being 5 minutes late isn't what they expected. Disagreeing with them, having a question about what they've said, or trying to hold them accountable for their behavior and what maybe they've done. All of this creates that it's a resistance to the fantasy, but you're breaking the fantasy escape of theirs of identity through you because you don't agree, or you're trying to hold them responsible, or there's something else about you're just not mirroring back the identity that they seek through you. So make no mistake about it, people with BPD are subsuming people with codependence because people with codependency, whether you know it yet or not, you're there over giving and over rescuing. You're trying to fix and you're trying to make the relationship, the impossible relationship, work, wherein there's the illusion of love, right? The illusion of the relationship, and you are in collusion with that subconsciously. And then as it gets more shockingly real that this person with BPD isn't who you thought they were, well, then like you might have been sharing somewhat in the borderline fantasy of how much they idealized and mirrored you in the beginning because they were seeking identity through you, seeking escapism from their own inner turmoil, and more, that repetition compulsion cycles that they don't consciously understand, and also their urge to merge with you. But more to the point, who you thought they were when they were developing this fantasy of escapism to seek identity through you, to find emotional safety through you, to exist through you, so they don't have to feel alone or abandoned. But the second you aren't that perfect mirror, the fantasy shatters, and they no longer can see, quote, lost self, fantasy aspects of the want for rescue from you, but they don't see you as different from themselves. So the fantasy really is the projection. The projective identification and the abject projection fantasy that subsumes the codependent is a cry, not spoken of and subconscious for the untreated people of BPD. It's a cry of rescue. It's a cry for rescue and reparation. And what happens to people with codependency then? Well, you have already something going on you need to know more about and heal and recover from and after the relationship with the borderline. But for the person with codependency, it's all about, and you learned this in childhood, out of your own pain. It's all about rescue, fix, save, overgive, externalize out. So it's like this seemingly wonderful match in the beginning because the fantasy the borderline is presenting that's going to subsume you starts with the idealization and starts with more to the point what that is for the borderline. It starts with what the codependent, with what the codependent or the non-borderline with the borderline, it starts with what you just find amazing, right? The attention, the idealization, the mirroring, and the person with BPD's codependent people pleasing, and all aimed at you. And this is something you've been needing from your childhood and beyond. And so, with that, the reality of that is it's sort of like a dream come true, and it is too good to be true. And all the focus, and you're fantastic, and you're extra fantastic, but this is all coming out of the borderline fantasy that they don't have a clue about, but it operates as that escape mechanism, protection and escape, but more to the point, it is a rescue fantasy, a fantasy of wanting to be rescued by, of course, one of the wounding parents or the wounding parent, but more so now in the sense of they don't know that consciously. You become, as I've said before, the next object other, the parent representation, but the borderline's fantasy that subsumes codependence is the fantasy of rescue, is the placing of identity in you, is the lack of the not knowing the boundary between a self they don't know and other, meaning you. And so everything that you do as they try to subsume you in this fantasy of rescue me, which is unconscious, and people with codependency already have an experience in childhood, parentification, or rescuing or attempting to rescue a parent to get your own needs met. Well, this becomes why the fit and the unhealthy bond is so compelling and intense, and it develops so quickly because as the borderline mounts the fantasy escapism of seek identity through you and the cry subconscious from the unconscious of rescue me, the codependent's right there going, I want to rescue, I want to rescue. And it doesn't start right in the beginning, right? Because there's all that intensity, all that idealization, all that, oh, wow, this is the person. I'm so excited. This is incredible, says the codependent. And then as it starts to kind of fall away and fall apart, and you start to encounter some splits to devaluation, whether they're micro or macro splits, and you start getting confused, and there's more and more discord and accusations, and all kinds of things just start to go haywire, as people know in retrospect, and maybe you still don't understand why. The fantasy of the borderline is all encompassing because there's no self, and it works on the magical thinking, which is feeling what they feel is really real. And it's all cognitively distorted. It's not really of reality at all. And it's designed to get you to mirror to them, to an identity with the cry of rescue me. And people with codependence are primed for the task of trying to rescue, trying to fix, trying to enable. So the very thing that people with codependency are primed to do from childhood woundedness is exactly what meets with the idealization stage and the mirroring and the wow, this is great stage of who you think they are. But more importantly, on a subconscious level, right from the get go, for people with codependency, you are being subsumed by an all too good to be true that you don't realize yet consciously. But the reason is because this is what happened to you in your childhood at some point, to some degree or other, by a parent, wherein they were just trying to, the parent would, you were trying to get your needs met from the parent, and the parent was likely getting you to meet their needs or trying to help you to meet their needs. And so you get doubly negated. And so this trains and inculcates you to this overgiving, this taking responsibility for others, this just avoiding and ignoring yourself, losing yourself. And so the borderline fantasy is all about subsuming the codependent. And that's what happens when a person with untreated BPD comes together with a codependent. And you might not realize you're being subsumed, but by the time the honeymoon phase and the idealization is over, and there's been splits to the valuation, micro or macro, like micro or really big splits, and the discord starts, and everything starts to fall apart, and you're like, as a codependent, you're like, what's happening here? Where the person that I just fell in love with or fell in love with, maybe it's been years, maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, where's the person that I love? Just where'd they go? And then the fight is not only, what the borderline fantasy is about, and you've been subsumed into a collusion and a different kind of role that you were trained for in childhood. This is not good, this is not healthy for you, but it still might be in your subconscious, or it might have been if you're looking back at it now. And so you were all too happy to overgive, to try to fix, to try to rescue. And that's what people with codependency learn in childhood. And then it meets with the borderline fantasy. And a fantasy that, like I said, it is a protection for the person with BPD, and it is also the person with BPD's protection. But again, it's a cry mounted from the unconscious repetition cycles of what BPD really is and why it is and what it really means, for rescue and for reparation. And the codependent is subsumed in that because you're seeking your own reparation and rescue for different reasons to varying degrees from that person with BPD. The borderline fantasy always subsumes the codependent. And then when it all goes south and it's so painful, etc., and you need to break that unhealthy bond, and they ghost you, or you have to break up with them, or whatever happens without the closure, and all the episodes and all the struggles in between, and the roller coaster, etc., and the walking on eggshells, then the person with codependency, who's been subsumed not just once, not just by the fantasy of the borderline or the borderline X, but you were subsumed by the rescue fantasy of a parent to one degree or another. And so now what are you supposed to do? This is the difficulty that people with codependency have on the other side of these relationships, to try to focus on the self again, because it's never really been the focus of a person with codependency self, in terms of what you were doing with a parent in your childhood. Why do you have a wounded inner child, and why do you have the pattern of a codependent relating really means? So more coming, and I hope that was helpful as food for thought, or in retrospect food for thought, because when people with codependency feel like they've lost themselves to these relationships, yes, and why? Because you were subsumed by the fantasy cry of rescue me of the borderline. And then, unbeknownst to you as a codependent, subsumed by the borderline fantasy, you also were hoping, maybe not on a conscious level, to get something to come back to you. And more importantly, on the inner child, the wounded inner child level, that part of yourself in your unconscious, not in your conscious awareness, was really looking for a really similar rescue to what the person with BPD and that borderline fantasy subsumed you with in terms of their need for rescue and their need to escape a lack of self and put their identity in you. So, I hope that gives you some food for thought, maybe a little bit of retrospective way of understanding, or maybe it's just something to think about, but I hope it's helpful. So, take care.